Well, energy media readers, we're going to dive into a very contentious topic today, which is I don't want to call it the mental health of the Alberta industry and political leaders, but it kind of looks that way in a way. And so I would like to welcome political scientist Melanee Thomas to the interview.
Hello.
And some of you will have read the column that I've written today, where basically my hypothesis is that the Alberta and in the hydrocarbon industry is facing an existential crisis from both the energy transition, which is demand destruction for hydrocarbon consumption, and from the climate crisis, which will bring more restrictive climate policy. So one would think that the Alberta industry leaders and the politicians would be looking for rational, evidence-based kind of policy discussions. Well, we know that that's not the case. We've got, the Vivian Krauss and her conspiracy narratives and all of that sort of stuff you can read about in the column. And I'm going to talk about that today with Professor Thompson. So what do we make of this, Melanee?
So to me, I find it really interesting that there is an existential threat here, but it's not the way that you're talking about it is not the way that it's being discussed in terms of the political narrative. So one of the things that really perked my ears during the federal election was to hear Premier Kenney say that Justin Trudeau's re-election was an existential threat to Alberta. In short, conflating partisan competition to regional economic interest. And for me, this starts to mirror in a way that I find as a researcher fascinating, but as also a citizen a little bit alarming. It's starting to mirror research that's much more advanced in the United States about what this kind of social polarization looks like when it gets politicized. And the short version is that I think instead of having a reasonable research-based conversation about what's going on with energy transition, where do we anticipate the market going, and how can we actually ask the Canadian Federation to help us with this? Instead, what we're having is a overheated partisan conversation about how if you are not conservative, you are ultimately an enemy of Alberta, which is in a lot of ways telling a lot of Albertans that they are enemies of their home, which is, a problem. But also I think it just is actually not helping anything at all anyway. So when I talk about partisan polarization, what I mean is I'm borrowing from work that's been done in the United States by a scholar named Liliana Mason. The book that she wrote kind of culminating this scholarship is called Uncivil Agreement: How Politics Became Our Identity. And what she's looking at is to see how you can get people who hold reasonably moderate views in the United States but be so angry at the idea of the party that isn't theirs actually winning an election. And I see, in reading her book, I see so many parallels in Canada that I think that Canadian politics have become polarized in the same kind of way. And I think this is driving a lot of this narrative. So polarized, it could mean one of two things. It could be that parties are actually holding more extreme views that are further away from each other. This is not that. This is more about social polarization. So the idea that, and I think what's happening is that multiple points of people's identity are lining up with their parties. And as a result, there are processes that are going on that make people see a threat in the other party. And as a result, it means that they're missing the other threats that they actually have to deal with. So this means you've got partisan bias and partisan discrimination. So anytime I hear somebody say people in the other party are just stupid or they're ignorant or things along those lines, that strikes me as partisan bias. Then you've got people who locate their own self-esteem or their own, how they see themselves with how well their party is doing. And so that means that they work really hard to protect the status of their party because their party's status is their status. And if you saw post 2015, I think there were a number of people with a lot of the really negative reactions that were quite overblown. I think what you see are people who were feeling initially this crisis of status because their people were no longer in government anymore, perhaps. It's a hypothesis, but I think it's a reasonable one. And then the third part of it is that when people are in this kind of polarized positions, they start to feel emotions on behalf of their parties. So anger at the loss, euphoria at the win, and often directed at partisan outgroups as well. So this would be the rage that say Trudeau's Liberals won. I looked at that as a scholar of elections and electoral voting behavior, and saw, like, the 2019 election, there were certainly unprecedented things like blackface that happened during the campaign, but the result was pretty status quo. Like, it wasn't actually that surprising. But the narrative coming out of the Alberta provincial government was that we've never been so divided, even though Alberta elected about the partisan, distribution of members that we've sent since 1972. Like, this is, like, we didn't even behave differently in terms of how we voted. But so the idea that suddenly this is more divided, suddenly there's an existential threat because the Liberals are in government again in Ottawa. Like, either this is a tool to dodge accountability and scrutiny for provincial actions, or it's marshaling this polarization to get people angry at Justin Trudeau and other people, and avoiding having other conversations, or it's some kind of combination of the two. Now, for me, to bring this back,
can I just jump in here, if you don't mind, Melanee? So I want to get at the root cause of this.
Yeah.
So do you think that this change in the narratives, this change in the way we perceive politics, has to do with our leadership changing? Our leaders have changed their narrative, like like Trump changed the narrative in the United States. Is there an economic explanation that we got big structural change and people are feeling, threatened and insecure? Is that what's your take on that?
So I think a lot of it has to end up doing with social identity. And so there's a couple of other elements of social identity in addition to the partisanship stuff. And part of it is identification with Alberta and identification with oil and gas. And so, I have a pretty new study in looking at public opinion in Alberta and other parts of Canada on energy transition specifically, like not just climate change, but how we feel about actually being asked about explicitly transitioning away from fossil fuels. Because I think people will react differently to that in Alberta than what we would do in terms of saying we should be adding renewables, right? Like, the existential threat comes from no more oil and gas. And so in that, I think people who identify as entrepreneurial, people who identify with a certain kind of business, see this as conflated completely with oil and gas, as in, like, if it's not oil and gas, we don't have it. And the leadership narrative now matches this. So instead of previous governments talking about economic diversification, which is where we get a super majority of Albertans saying that we feel like we're too dependent on oil and gas and that we should diversify away. Like, most Albertans think this, but this narrative that saying that and acting on that is now an existential threat is something that's a new leadership narrative as well. So the most explosive politics I'm seeing now are from people who conflate entrepreneurial, basically being an entrepreneur, being prosperous, being Albertan, with exclusively oil and gas, and also that means that they are conservative. And so when you line up all of those forms of social identity together, that helps create this narrative where otherwise it just doesn't make sense, to be honest. But this also leads to policies too, where we've just got a provincial budget that's cut renewable, like a number of things, like not just renewables. I'm thinking about the film industry things too, where the economic return on investment is so good that I'm not sure why we're not doing it. And the only way I can think of is that there's a different way of seeing the existential threat than I think the way that many of us could see it based on the evidence.
Okay, now let's talk about that existential threat, because I wrote a book in the spring called The New Alberta Advantage, Technology Policy and the Future of the Oil Sands, and the first two chapters deal with the energy transition. So this is real, it's driven by technology and capital and markets and consumers and all of that good stuff. It ain't driven by policy. Policy is actually secondary to the pace of the energy transition, in my view. So given that, this is not an existential threat that can be beaten back with an energy war room. This strikes at the very heart of the competitiveness of the industry. And it seems odd to me that Albertans are misinterpreting the nature of the existential threat. So who's responsible for that? Is it industry leaders? Is it politicians? Who screwed up, and when did they screw up?
I think it's a combination of things. I think part of it is that I would always assume that the average voter probably doesn't know what's going on with some of these details. And so, and I would also assume, I don't think that's a bad thing. Like, I'm not laughing at voters for not knowing things. I think it's rational and reasonable for voters to use shortcuts like what leaders say. I mean, things that I find striking. When did the biggest players start to abandon some of their projects? Like, I'm looking at European players, where if the European Commission is looking at being net zero and carbon neutral by 2050, there are a bunch of big European players that moved away from us a while ago, right? And so part of this is I'm looking at the homegrown industry and saying, how much of this is existential for them? Because if we don't keep doing business as usual, they actually don't have a business plan. So I think part of this is going to be an element of corporate Calgary, in part because other parts of corporate Calgary have already moved on, or are in the process of moving on. What I find interesting about this is that the political narrative about like jobs are only a certain kind of oil and gas job doesn't do anything with automation. And so we can see even local oil and gas firms making more money than becoming like they're profitable because of automation. And this means that we need to be talking about transitioning workers. But the problem is, as soon as you start talking about transitioning workers, that means that it opens up people to demand industry and also government to do better environmental and transition type policies. And that's expensive. And so I can imagine part of it is that maybe industry doesn't see it as their responsibility, though based on my study, most Albertans do think industry's got the biggest role to play, followed by the provincial government.
Can I jump in here? Because, okay, we agree that there's an existential threat, and the industry has got as this narrative that they have now is dominant. But one of the things that happened I don't know if you've read my columns, but I reported extensively on the conversations that took place between the big five oil sands CEOs and the environmental group's executive directors, and they had a year-long conversation, and they came to some common agreement on climate policy, et cetera, et cetera. That at that point was an entirely different narrative, and had that narrative remained in place, it would have offset the narrative that's now coming out of industry, out of CAP and out of some of the industry leaders. And it seems to me that narrative has withered on the vine. And in the absence of a competing narrative, this other, sort of right-wing defensive, very conservative, that narrative has just been allowed to run rampant. What do you take of that take?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair. I would say I would localize the narrative to us in particular, because I think that the bigger narrative exists elsewhere and is the dominant narrative and continues apace, which means that I think it's worth Albertans and other Canadians, especially. I think Canada is slow on this, and I think Alberta is the slowest. And so we should be aware that in keeping with this, we are becoming increasingly out of step with international markets, which should worry us economically. When I look at this from a political,
by the way, I agree wholeheartedly with that point.
Yeah, I mean, the existential threat is not somebody from a different partisan team. The existential threat is if we think that our prosperity comes from oil and gas, we need to start having a conversation about either like moving that prosperity or having the conversation in a way that we can actually continue to innovate on these files. So for me, for individual level voters, which is usually where my research focuses, I always ask, so where are they going to be getting their information about these narratives? And they're not going to be getting it from, say, any particular firms or companies or even individual politicians. They're not really going to be getting that directly from them. So certainly there's some social media where they're going to be getting that from, but it's usually going to be a media-driven narrative. So on some level, I also think that there's a corresponding gutting that's happening of, say, more conventional media outlets, or an effort to actively discredit more conventional media, because this is where people are going to be getting that kind of information from. Part of it could be editorial choice, that we're not actually talking about how the current government of Alberta is out of step with certain aspects of industry, and that we should be worried about this. I mean, it's one thing for you and I to be saying this in various forms of scholarship or columns or things along these lines, but what I suspect would happen is that if the narrative were to be empirically accurate, i.e., do the fact checking that we have in the United States every time Donald Trump says a falsehood, like you actually have a paragraph behind it after following it saying the president said this is known to be false. If we were doing similar sorts of things where like this is the narrative and yet this is what we know about the international market, like we're so not there yet, but like if that were the narrative, then I think the public would potentially be seeing this a little bit more differently. So I mean, I would throw the media in there as well, but for me, the real crisis of leadership, while this is not a policy driven, like the agent of change here is not policy, but I do think that government and political leaders have a responsibility to actually advocate for the long game and advocate for the long term, right? And they're not doing it. Like, and this is the thing, like if they're going to sit there and double down on a short-term narrative without actually saying, listen, this is a hard conversation and we might not want to have it because it's uncomfortable, because it's existential. Like we need leaders to do that. Otherwise they're not leading. And so, I mean, one of the conclusions that I would draw is that the particular kind of leadership that we're being offered is one that is anemic and problematic, precisely because it does not do the job that it needs to do.
I have argued in columns, and I think this is a defensible argument, is that Alberta, as long as it remains misaligned with the climate crisis and with the energy transition, it will remain misaligned with the federal government, with many of its provincial counterparts, and it will be misaligned with what's going on internationally in terms of markets and so on that we talked about. And as long as it's misaligned like that, it cannot get what it needs. It simply can't. I mean, it won't have the political support to get a new pipeline built or whatever it needs. It won't have support from the federal government. And it actually is working counter to its own interests, whether they be short-term or whether they be long-term. And that, I think, gets back to your comment about leadership. And over and over again, I'm coming back to this conclusion that the real crisis here in the short term is the really poor leadership that's being shown by the industry and by the conservative parties that are taking advantage of that. What do you think?
So one of the things that comes through in this is new research project that I've got about how Albertans think and feel about energy transition is that one of the biggest predictors and most consistent predictors of opposition to transition is economic conservatism. And so for me, I think that many of the people who are telling me that in a basic public opinion survey, like regular folks, probably aren't necessarily paying attention much to the international market. I know enough from other forms of public opinion research that if industry were saying we're misaligned with the market, if government were saying we're misaligned with the market, we need to take action to align ourselves with the market, that public opinion would follow. And particularly, one of the things that I find kind of incoherent about this project that I've got is that people who tell me that they have great faith in the market are, as you say, misaligned with it. And so for me, I can't escape this idea that there is a degree of public ignorance, and I think that's fine. Like, I want people to know that I'm not judging based on that. It's just an empirical observation. But I don't quite know what else to do when the people who tell me that they have the most faith in the market are supporting policies and positions that simply are completely out of step with the market. These people would follow if they had opinion leaders that would lead them. And so I think we're saying much the same thing. I'm coming at it from a public opinion perspective, and you're coming at it from a more energy-based market perspective, but I think we're saying much the same thing.
Well, let me ask you a question in which we may or may not agree. During the campaign, I put out a video saying, Rachel Notley, please talk about your energy policies. And I've since criticized her for, in fact, I said it in the book, that neither she nor her environment minister, Shannon Phillips, nor her energy minister, Marg McQuaid-Boyd, didn't have an energy narrative, a coherent energy narrative, and B, didn't sell it. And we're probably incapable now of selling it. So it seems to me that if we're going to have an alternate energy narrative, that the opposition party would be a logical place to look for that. And thus far, the Rachel Notley in opposition, the NDP, have been an utter failure on this point. Your thoughts, please.
So I think The New Democrats in their current form in opposition are hampered by the things that they had to say while they were in government to avoid having a bit of a to avoid being absolutely beaten with a cudgel about pipelines and things. And so while in government, the choices were made by the New Democrat government to support a pro-pipeline narrative, and it was supposed to be offset with the climate leadership plan. The difficulty is that now in opposition, Rachel Notley has doubled down quite aggressively, and I think in some contexts quite condescendingly, in terms of pipelines. And the thing is, anybody who knows anything about the Trans Mountain Pipeline project knows that what's stalling it is not political will. It is very much courts. It's questions about Indigenous title and what it means to consult. And if we were looking for the other big existential threat, that would be it. And it's the existential threat to like what it means for land in the Canadian state and how we talk about like a country in terms of its borders. Like, and this is a conversation I don't think any Canadians are actually prepared to have, and the courts will make us have it. So I find that the narrative that's coming out of the opposition now is one note, and it's pipelines, 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 and if you don't agree with me, you're ignorant. And I don't think that this is helpful. And in particular, what it means is that because of those choices, they're not able to talk about how bad an investment decision it was for the current government to cut the previous government's policies and programs on energy efficiency, because those were investments that were small potatoes in terms of government operations that had big payoffs. And so I feel as though, this is why I say in their current formation, previous choices I think are binding them in ways that are not useful, but I also think that the opposition needs to take steps to be able to transform those, like basically to break those boundaries to be able to talk about this in a more productive way, because it's the pipeline isn't a political problem anymore. Like that, it's a very different kind of problem. What is a political problem is our willingness to actually engage in energy transition, to talk about what that means for the workers, to talk about what that means for electricity generation. And this is where the NDP should be making hay in this current context, and they're not doing it. So I'm with you. I think it is disappointing, but I'm not surprised.
The final question. This has been a very, very interesting conversation. We're going to have more of these. So the last question is, in my opinion, I think that the only solution to the impasse that Alberta finds it in, it needs better leadership. It needs better leadership within industry. It needs better leadership within politics. And I don't see anybody that is preparing, that has the credibility, that has the narrative and the vision and the expertise and political skills, all of the things that would be needed to advance another narrative, a competing narrative that had credibility. Do you see anybody?
I think that the existing actors, at least on the political side of things, are sufficiently skilled. I think that they're just making bad decisions. And so I mean, especially whenever I listen to Premier Kenney speak about equalization, I know he knows better because he wrote the equalization formula that we're dealing with. When I listen to Rachel Notley speak as leader of the official opposition and only talk about pipelines, I know she knows better because of the climate leadership plan that her government passed and acted on. One of the things that I think that is going to be the most difficult conversation is actually going to be in industry, because there will be some industries where they simply aren't viable as we transition. And I think that's kind of always been the case in terms of the way that businesses worked in Alberta, precisely because of the nature of our product. And so I think it's the industry leaders that can be forgiven for not necessarily wanting to have a conversation where the end result of that existential the existential talk is that they don't exist anymore. I get that. I can understand why that's a group that wants to shy away from that conversation, but the politicians, they don't have to do that. I mean, look at Peter Lougheed. Every time he spoke at various oil and gas organizations, he would be given admittance to tell them something they didn't want to hear, and then they would bar him again until he was prepared to say something again. I mean, and this is the thing, leaders, there's this aversion in an era of a permanent election campaign. There's an aversion to actually saying the things that need to be said to actually move us to the future that we need to be in. And so if I were going to lay blame and responsibility for the failure to move this conversation forward, it is solidly on the political side of things. things. And it's not because the people who are involved are insufficiently skilled. It's because they lack the political will. And they're making a conscious choice to not have the conversation. And I think they should be held accountable for the choices that they make, including this one. It's not a good choice. They need to be making different choices, especially if we want to be prosperous down the road. And so I think in 10 years, we'll be reflecting very critically back on the choices that we were making, in the past couple of weeks. I mean, to our detriment. I think it'll be much harder at that point, but.
Hopefully my column today and this video will make a little bit of a contribution to rectifying that. And so thank you very much, Melanee. We look forward to chatting with you in the future, and have a great day.
Yes, you as well. Thank you.